They entered the Hurtgen Forest believing it would be simple, a minor operation on the flank of the Great Push toward Aachen, a clearing action before the real battles began. But by the first week of October 1944, the American infantrymen of the 4th Infantry Division realized the forest was not merely terrain, it was a trap built by nature and perfected by the enemy. The Hurtgen was a dark, suffocating world where daylight barely pierced the thick pine canopy, where every movement felt watched, and where every step could trigger a mine buried beneath wet leaves. The trees stood so close together that a man could reach out and touch 2 trunks at once, and the forest floor was a maze of ravines, slick mud, and narrow trails that swallowed vehicles whole. It was a place designed to break armies, and the Germans defending it, elite Fallschirmjäger units hardened by years of combat, knew every inch of it. The Americans did not. They came straight from the open fields of France, accustomed to air support, tank breakthroughs, and rapid advances. None of that worked here. Tanks sank into soft earth or became stuck between trees. Artillery shells burst in the canopy overhead, turning pine branches into deadly wooden shrapnel. Aircraft saw nothing through the dense cover, and every trail was pre-registered by German mortars. The infantry fought alone. Soldiers later said the forest felt alive and hostile. Fog clung to the ground, muffling sound, hiding movement, creating the unnerving sense that an unseen hand was always reaching toward them. The rain never seemed to stop. Helmets dripped, ponchos clung to cold skin, and somewhere in the distance, almost always, a single MG-42 would tear through the silence with its ripping metallic scream, echoing between the trees like a warning that the Fallschirmjäger were out there, watching. The Americans had been told their enemies were exhausted, low on men, short on supplies. Instead, they found German paratroopers, some of the best light infantry in Europe, embedded in camouflaged bunkers, interlocking strongpoints, and sniper nests cut invisibly into the forest walls. The Fallschirmjäger had spent months preparing the Hurtgen for exactly this kind of fight. They laced the approaches with S-minen, Teller anti-tank mines, and tripwire charges. They built kill zones where Americans advancing down narrow trails would suddenly find themselves trapped between machine guns firing from multiple angles. They learned the patterns of the U.S. artillery, listened to the timing of barrages, and slipped back into their positions the moment the shelling lifted. They turned the terrain into a living weapon, and the Americans, new to forest fighting, paid for every yard. Platoons disappeared into the mist only to stagger back missing half their men. Patrols walked into minefields so dense that medics could not reach the wounded without risking themselves. When U.S. units attempted to flank the German lines, they found themselves channeled into ravines already zeroed in by mortars. Even the weather became an ally of the defenders. Cold seeped into boots, stiffening toes and slowing reaction time. Damp air ruined radio equipment. Fog grounded observation planes. The Germans waited in prepared bunkers while the Americans groped forward blindly. Casualties climbed so quickly that some companies were combat ineffective within days. Officers fell. NCOs took over. Then they fell too. Replacements arrived without orientation, learning the forest the same way their predecessors had, through terror. The worst part, veterans said later, was the silence between the attacks. In Normandy, in the hedgerows, even in the streets of Aachen, battle had a rhythm, movement, fire, response. In Hurtgen, there was nothing, just the wind sliding through pine needles, the crack of a branch underfoot, the distant cough of a German rifle. Soldiers began to fear the quiet more than the explosions. Quiet meant the Fallschirmjäger were waiting. When the Germans struck, they hit with precision. A single machine gun could hold up an entire battalion. A lone sniper could halt a company for hours. Mortar shells came without warning, exploding among men who had no space to spread out. The forest compressed everything: sound, movement, fear, until the fighting became intimate and brutal. Often at ranges so close soldiers could hear the enemy breathing. Young American infantrymen who had crossed France with confidence now felt powerless. Every mistake had consequences. Every assumption about how war worked was shattered. They had entered Hurtgen thinking the forest was an obstacle. They were learning, day by bleeding day, that it was an opponent. And somewhere inside that dark maze, the Fallschirmjäger waited for them, patient and disciplined, ready to show them what it meant to fight on German terms. Before the Americans ever saw a German soldier in the Hurtgen, they felt the presence of the Fallschirmjäger. It was in the burst of an S-mine that sent ball bearings slicing through tree trunks. It was in the sudden metallic shriek of an MG-42 cutting across a trail the moment a squad stepped into the open. It was in the silence that settled after a mortar attack, too precise, too perfectly timed to be random. The paratroopers of the Wehrmacht were not ordinary infantry. They were elite light troops trained to exploit terrain, camouflage, and small unit tactics. In the Hurtgen forest, those skills turned them into ghosts. The first thing the Americans learned was that the Germans were never where they expected them to be. Patrols sent forward to probe the line reported spotting movement, then losing it, then being hit from a direction they thought was secure. Fallschirmjäger squads operated in small, flexible groups, slipping between trees, appearing only long enough to fire a burst before melting back into the forest. They moved silently, communicating with hand signals, guiding American units into preset kill zones. Even officers with years of experience said they had never faced an enemy so hard to find and so efficient at disappearing. The second thing the Americans learned was that the Germans had spent months preparing the forest. Every trail was mined, every clearing covered by machine guns. Ravines were booby-trapped, crossroads were registered for immediate mortar fire. The Fallschirmjäger understood that the U.S. Army relied on fire and maneuver, so they created a battlefield where maneuver was impossible and fire was ineffective. When American troops advanced, they funneled into predictable paths. When they stopped, the mortar fire began. When they flanked, they walked into mines. The forest belonged to the Germans because the Germans had shaped it. The MG-42 was their signature. Its blistering rate of fire, 1,200 rounds per minute, echoed endlessly through the trees, making it impossible to locate. A single gun team, hidden behind logs or buried inside a camouflaged bunker, could hold off an entire company. Many Americans described the sound as mechanical terror. It wasn't the volume of fire that frightened them, it was the rhythm, the long ripping sound that seemed to tear the air itself apart. Paratroopers used the weapon with unmatched discipline, opening fire only at the perfect moment, when an American platoon bunched up on a trail or tried to cross a shallow clearing. Then the forest erupted with energy, and men dove for the ground, some already hit, others pinned without hope of movement. And even if they managed to silence one gun, another waited deeper in the trees. Mortars were the Germans' second great equalizer. In open terrain, American artillery could counter battery fire or spot concentrations from the air. In Hurtgen, there was no sky, only branches. German forward observers hid in the treetops or in tiny slits cut into the hillside. They watched Americans crawl through the mud, marked their coordinates, and unleashed 80mm mortars with deadly accuracy. Shells exploded just above the ground, spraying shrapnel horizontally. Tree bursts shredded entire squads before they ever saw the enemy. One lieutenant wrote in his journal that it felt like the forest itself was detonating. Camouflage was another German advantage. American soldiers swore that they were being attacked by invisible men. Only when they captured a position did they understand why. The Fallschirmjäger used whitewashed ponchos to blend with fog, painted helmets to match bark textures, and dug bunkers so expertly that observers standing 10 feet away couldn't spot them. Machine guns were mounted on rails inside logs, allowing entire defensive lines to shift fire without revealing positions. Snipers built nests inside hollow trees, firing through tiny apertures that from a distance appeared to be natural knotholes. The Fallschirmjäger also exploited psychological pressure. They kept American units exhausted with nighttime harassing fire, sniper shots at dawn, and sudden bursts of MG-42 at random intervals. The goal was simple: keep the enemy awake, afraid, and uncertain. As fatigue set in, discipline broke down, squads bunching up, men hesitating at intersections, patrol leaders ignoring compass bearings. Mistakes that would be minor elsewhere became fatal in Hurtgen. And through all of this, the Germans fought with a stubbornness that shocked even experienced U.S. officers. They counterattacked after losing positions. They refused to retreat unless ordered. They held ground with tenacity, born not of fanaticism, but of training and professionalism. These were not the last-ditch Volkssturm units the Americans would face months later. These were battle-hardened paratroopers who had fought in Italy, Normandy, and Holland, and who understood precisely how to bleed a larger, better-supplied enemy. By the end of the second week, it was clear. The Americans were not fighting a battle, they were being taught a lesson, and the Fallschirmjäger were instructors without mercy. By late October 1944, the Hurtgen Forest had become a graveyard of American assumptions. Every doctrine brought from Normandy, mass movement, armored support, rapid advance, had been stripped away by trees, mud, mines, and an enemy that refused to fight on any terms but its own. The U.S. Army had entered expecting a supporting operation. Instead, it found itself in the most punishing infantry battle of its European campaign. Companies that began the month with 200 men were reduced to 60. Some platoons were led by privates because every officer and sergeant had been killed or wounded. Veterans of Utah Beach and San Lo said Hurtgen was worse than anything they had seen before. Yet headquarters continued to order attacks. The forest had to be cleared, they insisted, to protect the flank of operations toward the Rohr dams. The mission expanded even as units disintegrated. Commanders rotated divisions through the line, but the results remained the same: confusion, exhaustion, and casualties rising faster than replacements could fill the gaps. The moment of reckoning came when it became clear that American tactics were failing not because of lack of bravery, but because they were fundamentally mismatched to the environment. Sending battalions forward along narrow forest trails only allowed the Fallschirmjäger to slaughter them one segment at a time. Trying to flank German positions simply led units into fresh minefields or interlocking bunkers. Even artillery barrages seemed useless. Shells that would have torn open fields in Normandy now burst in the treetops, showering shrapnel down onto the very troops they were supposed to protect. Commanders realized they were losing battles they never should have fought this way. And so slowly, painfully, at the cost of thousands of casualties, the U.S. Army began to adapt. The first major tactical shift involved artillery. American observers learned to call for tree-burst barrages, deliberate detonations in the canopy above German positions. The effect was devastating. Branches became splinters, shrapnel ricocheted into trenches, and machine gun crews were driven from concealed nests. Paratroopers who had once mocked American artillery now feared it. The second adaptation came from the engineers. They became the most essential soldiers in the forest, moving ahead of infantry to clear mines, blow open trails, destroy booby traps, and cut lanes through the undergrowth. Many died doing so, crawling on hands and knees with bayonets probing the earth, while MG-42 fire snapped overhead. But without engineers, no unit could advance more than a few yards. Some battalions joked, grimly, that they survived only because the engineers cleared a path to die on. American infantry also had to relearn how to fight. Units began advancing in dispersed formations rather than bunching along trails. Fire teams moved from tree to tree, maintaining constant visual contact, never assuming a direction was safe simply because a map said so. Squad leaders held men close enough to support each other, but far enough apart that a single burst of machine gun fire couldn't wipe them all out. Patrols became stealthier, quieter, more methodical. Gone were the open-field rushes of France. In Hurtgen, a platoon advanced like hunters, listening, pausing, waiting for a sign of movement, then striking suddenly to overrun a position before the Fallschirmjäger could regroup. But perhaps the most important adaptation came from coordination. In early operations, battalions had attacked separately, each struggling alone in its sector. By November, commanders finally synchronized infantry, artillery, engineers, and armor, what little armor could move through the forest, in a combined push. Smoke screens were used to blind German observers. Heavy artillery isolated strong points before infantry closed in. Engineers followed closely, clearing the next lane as soon as a position was overrun. Slowly, painfully, the Americans learned to unravel the German defense one bunker at a time. Still, every gain came at a price. The forest resisted progress as fiercely as the Germans did. Soldiers slipped into ravines hidden by fallen leaves. Streams became icy traps where men broke ankles or drowned under packs. Cold rain soaked through uniforms, numbing fingers until rifles jammed and grenades slipped from frozen hands. Trench foot spread. Frostbite claimed toes and fingers. The wounded often could not be evacuated. Stretcher teams were shot at, and medical jeeps could not navigate the trails. And yet, even as casualties mounted, the Americans discovered something unexpected. When they adapted, the Fallschirmjäger felt it. The German defenders who had once dominated every encounter now found their bunkers isolated by coordinated barrages, their minefields breached, their flanking attempts blunted by American patrols operating with newfound discipline. A battle that had been entirely one-sided began to tilt, inch by inch, tree by bloody tree. It was not a sudden shift. There was no breakout, no dramatic victory. There was only attrition, endless, grinding attrition, as the U.S. Army reshaped itself into a force capable of fighting in the most hostile terrain it had ever faced. But the men on the ground understood something deeper. Hurtgen was teaching them how to survive, how to improvise, how to fight an enemy that had once seemed invincible. They were paying for those lessons in blood, frost, and mud, but they were learning. And the Fallschirmjäger, once the unquestioned masters of the forest, began to sense that their advantage was fading. By early November 1944, American infantrymen in the Hurtgen forest had begun to fight like the very enemy that had been mauling them for weeks. The shift was not theoretical or doctrinal. It emerged organically from the mud, the blood, and the cold. Men who had survived repeated ambushes learned to anticipate them. Men who had been pinned down by a single MG-42 came to understand how to flank it. And officers finally accepted that the forest was not a place for grand maneuvers. It was a place for squads and platoons, moving slowly, silently, killing or dying within 10 yards of the enemy. The transformation began with reconnaissance. Early in the battle, American patrols had blundered forward in tight groups, talking loudly, unaware of German observation posts hidden above them in the trees. By November, patrol leaders sent scouts ahead alone, crawling on their stomachs, pausing for minutes at a time to listen for the faint metallic click of an MG-42 bolt being pulled back or the whisper of German voices carried on the fog. They moved without helmets to reduce noise, wrapped their boots in cloth to soften their steps, and used captured German tripwire markers to find mines before stepping into them. Patrols became predatory. When they found a German outpost, they reported it immediately, so artillery could turn the position into splinters before the enemy even knew it was targeted. American infantry also learned to use fire in ways that mirrored the Fallschirmjäger. Instead of waiting for full battalion orders, platoons created their own kill zones. A BAR gunner would take a position overlooking a narrow trail. Riflemen would hide on either flank, choosing angles where their shots would cross. When German paratroopers attempted a counterattack, something they did frequently and with skill, they walked straight into a carefully prepared ambush. It was a reversal so stark that captured Germans later admitted they had been shocked by how quickly American small-unit tactics had improved. But the greatest shift occurred in the relationship between infantry and artillery. In the early weeks, American units had struggled to call fire effectively because radios failed in the cold and fog, and because dense trees distorted sound. By November, forward observers grew adept at reading the forest. They learned to position themselves in shallow depressions to avoid tree-burst shrapnel. They carried spare wire spools to lay field telephones in case radios failed. And they practiced adjusting barrages by listening not for explosions, but for the cracking of branches overhead, an indication the shells were bursting in the right place. As a result, artillery fire became brutally precise. German strongpoints that had survived days of fighting suddenly collapsed under intense, localized bombardments. A single, well-adjusted battery could silence an MG nest that had held off companies for hours. Engineers remained at the center of every advance.
They crawled through mud and snow to clear mines with their hands. They blew gaps in log bunkers using satchel charges. They constructed corduroy roads, layers of logs laid sideways to allow supply jeeps to move forward. At night, they marked safe lanes with white tape or luminous paint so infantry could pass without triggering buried explosives. Many of them died, but without their work, no American progress was possible. One of the most important adaptations was emotional, not tactical. Soldiers stopped thinking about taking the forest. They focused on taking one bunker, then another, and another. Victory was no longer measured in miles. It was measured in meters, in the capture of a weapons pit, in gaining control of a ravine, in silencing one machine gun that had tormented them for days. With these changes came a shift in morale. Units that felt helpless began to feel competent. They recognized the patterns in German defenses, how the Fallschirmjäger built overlapping fields of fire, how they concealed snipers in hollow trees, how they disguised bunkers with branches. The forest was still deadly, but it no longer felt unknowable. The Germans felt the change too. Paratroopers who had once slipped effortlessly between positions found themselves pursued by American patrols who matched their stealth with equal determination. Bunker lines that had once stalled entire regiments were isolated and destroyed by coordinated infantry engineer teams. When German units counterattacked, they did so against Americans who no longer panicked under mortar fire, who no longer bunched up in kill zones, who no longer assumed the forest was theirs to lose. Yet adaptation did not eliminate suffering. Cold rain continued to soak through uniforms. Frostbite crippled men more effectively than bullets. Mud turned foxholes into pits of freezing water. Rotting leaves produced a stench that clung to clothing and hair. Some men went days without sleep, jumping at every snapped twig. Chaplains buried bodies in shallow graves because the ground was too hard to dig deeper. Still, something fundamental had shifted. The Fallschirmjäger were no longer fighting a disoriented army. They were fighting an evolving one, an army that had absorbed the lessons of the forest and begun to turn them back on their teachers. The Americans had not yet won, but for the first time, they were no longer simply enduring the Hurtgen. They were starting to master it, and in the dark, frozen depths of that terrible forest, mastery was the only path to survival.
By December 1944, after months of agony, adaptation, and attrition, American forces finally began to break through the German defensive lines in the Hurtgen forest. But if the map showed progress, villages captured, ridges secured, bunkers destroyed, the men who fought there saw only the arithmetic of survival. How many were still alive? How many had been carried back through the mud? How many empty helmets lay beside foxholes half filled with frozen rainwater? The victory, when it came, felt hollow, quiet, and terribly expensive. No triumphant breakthrough marked the end of the Hurtgen. Instead, it eroded slowly. German units, battered by weeks of bombardment and starved of reinforcements, began to withdraw to secondary positions. Some Fallschirmjäger companies had been reduced from 120 men to fewer than 25. Others surrendered only when completely surrounded. Yet even in retreat, they fought with discipline and deadly precision, slipping between trees, establishing new ambush sites, and forcing the Americans to win the forest one bloody clearing at a time. When the town of Schmidt finally fell into American hands, a central objective that had eluded them for weeks, the men who entered it found little more than ruins, shattered timber, and corpses frozen in abandoned trenches. It was a victory without celebration. They were too exhausted to feel triumph, too aware of the price paid, and too cold to care. The cost of the Hurtgen Forest campaign was staggering. More than 33,000 American casualties, killed, wounded, missing, or evacuated from exposure, had been suffered in an area barely 50 square miles. Entire companies had vanished. Some battalions were so depleted they ceased to exist as fighting units. Field hospitals overflowed with frostbite cases, trench foot infections, and psychological trauma. Medics later said that in Hurtgen, they treated almost as many men for weather and shock as for bullet wounds. Yet perhaps the cruelest truth emerged only later. Strategically, the forest had offered almost nothing. The Roar River dams were important, yes, but the Hurtgen itself, its ridges, its roads, its endless trees, held no decisive value. The battle had been fought largely because commanders believed the flank needed protection, because maps suggested the forest would be a limited operation, because no one anticipated how effectively the Germans would exploit the terrain. The U.S. Army had bled itself for ground that, in hindsight, could have been bypassed or surrounded. For the survivors, this realization cut deeper than any wound. They had endured a nightmare, not for glory or for conquest, but because the logic of war had led them into a place where logic did not survive. Still, those who lived through the Hurtgen understood something profound. They had learned in that forest lessons that would shape the remainder of the war. First, they learned never to underestimate the German soldier again. The Fallschirmjäger had demonstrated that even a depleted Wehrmacht, if given strong defensive ground, could inflict catastrophic losses on a superior force. Never again in the European campaign did American commanders assume an attack would be easy simply because the enemy was retreating elsewhere. The Battle of the Bulge, which erupted just days after Hurtgen ended, proved how vital that newfound humility was. Second, they learned the importance of combined arms coordination at every level. Engineers, artillerymen, medics, infantrymen, and forward observers had worked together in ways that would become standard doctrine in the final push into Germany. The bitter truth of Hurtgen, that no branch of Syrtis could survive alone, reshaped operations all the way to the Rhine. Third, they learned the psychological cost of prolonged exposure to hostile terrain. Modern U.S. Army studies still cite Hurtgen as a case study in combat stress, morale collapse, and the physical limits of infantry endurance. Men who walked out of the forest carried its shadows with them for the rest of their lives. Even decades later, veterans spoke of Hurtgen in hushed tones, calling it the Green Hell, the Death Factory, or simply that place. And finally, they learned adaptability under pressure. The American army that exited the Hurtgen was not the same one that entered it. It had been forced to evolve, to rethink tactics, reorganize units, refine communication, and fight with precision instead of momentum. Those hard-won skills helped it crush Germany's defenses in the final months of the war and contributed to an institutional knowledge that defined U.S. military doctrine long after 1945. But no amount of adaptation could erase what the forest had taken. The Hurtgen Forest Campaign remains one of the most costly and controversial operations the U.S. Army ever executed in Europe, a battle many historians argue should never have been fought at all. Yet for the survivors, the meaning lay not in strategy but in memory, the comrades they lost, the terror they endured, and the resilience they found within themselves when the world narrowed to darkness, snow, and the muzzle flash of an unseen MG-42. In the end, the Hurtgen Forest did not break the U.S. Army, but it reshaped it through fire, through suffering, and through lessons learned the hardest possible way.